once I've Googled Neophysicoccum parvum online, I've recently found that not only did it come from grapevines, but it has affected other trees, including oriental planes, eucalyptus in various countries, and perhaps strangest of all, quite recently, Sequoiadendron giganteum.
Today, Jim Chambers is going to be talking about diseases of the London plane tree. He includes words in another language, like the irrepressible
Piptoporus betulina
and Massaria, and one of my favourites, but probably only because it's got rhythm, Inonotus hispidus. Tree people need to use Latin names for tree species, like Quercus robur for the common oak, and Metasequoia glyptostroboides, which frankly sounds like something you'd rather not admit to at the doctor's. On the other hand, Dawn Redwood, its English name, sounds positively romantic. It almost sounds like it's come straight out of a Jane Austen novel. Elspeth, tie up the horses, would you? Then join me underneath the crown of the Dawn Redwood, where we can view our country estate from afar. I myself, in my old professional chef guise, had to learn to scream things in French like envoyer, ça marche, filet de sole vin blanc. Am I the only one working in here? Oh yeah, that. In my life, I have to take a pill called phenoxymethylpenicillin. And I mean, for heaven's sake, if you're in trees, you go into the tree industry, you have to learn the word arboricultural, which is being kept because, to the best of my knowledge, no one's managed to come up with a better word to encompass the profession. Unless, of course, you've got a better word to encompass the profession, in which case I expect loads of emails to come through to my bag.
Listen to the Tree Lady talk.
Well, welcome to Jim Chambers from Tim Moyer Associates. Jim, so good to see you. Could you just tell people a little bit about yourself, please?
Hi Sharon, Jim Chambers, as you say, aka James Chambers. I'm a principal art consultant at TMA. I've been in this business for too long, over 20 years now, and I was previously urban forest manager at Islington Council for a few years, but I worked there in total for about 13 years before I came over to Tim Moyers. So we deal with only risk condition, specialist investigation, that kind of thing.
And we saw each other at the ARB conference. It was fabulous, wasn't it? Did you have a good time?
I really enjoyed it. Yes, it was great. Really enjoyable conference. I was quite intrigued by it. In all honesty, I wasn't necessarily grabbed by the title when it first came out, but I'm very glad I went because it was probably the best conference I've been to.
I agree. It was really the best conference I've been to with the AA. Really,
I've
really
heard several
good.
people say that actually. It was really interesting. It was very high pace. I found it very, very intense. There was lots going on all the time, and not a minute to sit down. Really, it was great. Really interesting.
And we were both at the field trip on Sunday where we walked on Cork Abbey. And whilst we were there, you were talking about fungi on a London plane, and you said something that I hadn't heard before. I said, it's a word of the week. Jim, what was our word of the week?
It's two words. It's Neophysicoccum parvum. Yeah, I'll say it again. Neophysicoccum parvum.
Wow, that's brilliant. What is it and why does it matter?
It's a fungus, and I'd never heard of it either until a few years ago now. I was surveying some trees, some plane trees, and I noted some lesions. I can show you a picture in a moment. Just small lesions on the. I didn't really enter my mind at all. I noted them because they were there, but there was no significance that I was aware of. At some point, I don't remember when that was. It must have been 2016, I think. And at some point following that, one of the trees that had these two sort of small lesions started to suffer physiologically. And so when I was asked to go and have another look at it, I kind of considered that again. It was obvious to me that this wasn't in any way cancroplain because the lesions look nothing like what we've seen. Not that I've ever seen that in real life, but the images have been shared with us about canker stain. But I decided to take a sample using a increment borer and send it off to Forest Research. And lo and behold, that's the first time I ever heard of Neophysicoccum parvum, because that was a fungus that was present in the sample I sent. That was isolated by Dr. Anna Perez Sierra at Forest Research. I don't think she'd heard of it until that point either. But she did when she let me know that that's what she'd found. She also sent me a paper from Geneva, where some ARBs in that country had found some planes which were all dying, and they assumed that it was probably canker stain. So they tested each. I think it was 6 trees. They tested 6 of the trees, and off the top of my head, 4 of them had no canker stain, but 2 of them did. They were in. I don't think they were even together. Anyway, eventually all 6 of the trees died and had to be removed, and the 4 that didn't have canker stain, they tested them more thoroughly and found, among a few other things, Neophysococcum parvum in those trees. They then did further tests using inoculating small trees deliberately to see what happened, and determined that N. parvum, or plain canker as it's now been called, is pathogenic on plane trees. So going back to the first tree I found it on, that tree was a very large tree in central London. It was protected, and it declined very rapidly shortly after this initial decline, and physiologically. There was also some decay, which may have been due to Inonotus. We thought it probably was, but we hadn't seen any fruit bodies, so we didn't know exactly what was happening. The tree right next to it, I should have mentioned, I sampled that as well, and that also has N. parvum. However, that tree is still there, and as of the last time I saw it, it was fine. It had these lesions.
So, Jim, we're now recording this on video as well, so listeners can go to our YouTube channel as well as listening on all of the podcast platforms. So, Jim, what does this fungus look like?
I don't know. It's microscopic and doesn't produce fruit bodies in the same way as Inonotus or Ganoderma, for example. So the indicator that I am aware of, and the call sign of it, if you like, the thing to look out for, are vertical lesions with callus growth, which can appear pretty much anywhere on the stem of the plane tree, or on large branches, sometimes on the underside or on the side. There doesn't seem to be any pattern I've identified yet as to why or where these lesions appear, but they are, Anna and I are absolutely convinced that they are the key indicator, give you a clue that there's something going on. The interesting thing, well, there's a whole host of interesting things about it, is, as I mentioned, there were 2 trees that I found it on initially. Both the first 2 trees I tested had it. At some point later, I can't remember exactly, I've got this all detailed somewhere, but so let's say a year later, lesions appeared in most of the other plane trees in the same garden. And so as part of the investigation that Anna and I have been doing since 2017, I think, we got a MUP and tested all of these lesions. The first lesions were accessible from ground level, but all of the secondary batch that I noticed were way up in the crown, 20 meters plus. So we got a MUP in and tested every single one of those lesions, sterilizing all the equipment in between, as always, on the same day, in exactly the same way that we tested the first 2. And Anna took those samples away and tested all of those samples in exactly the same way, and all of them came back negative. Now, again, more questions and answers. No idea how or why that happened. Since first isolating the original sample, I've noticed these kinds of lesions all over the place on plane trees, pretty much everywhere. Not literally everywhere, but pretty much everywhere. They are commonplace in plane trees in London, and that's an interesting factor. So I was concerned, because the conclusion of the report I mentioned earlier from Geneva said that while it didn't say that trees died because of N. parvum, it said that they had evidence that there may be another fungus which acts in a similar way to canker stain. But it's all a bit vague, and there are a lot of questions, more questions than answers, really. So this pathogenic fungi, which was previously known on grapevines, apparently, has evolved, if you like, to now be pathogenic on plane trees. And we've had one plane tree which had it and also was physiologically severely affected. But as I mentioned already, I've seen it on many, many other plane trees across London, and I've not noticed any others so far that have been so badly affected, even though the lesions are identical. There does seem to be, in some cases, some exudates, minor exudates from those lesions, not all the time. That seems to be a process that isn't continuous. And the interesting thing, as I mentioned, with the first place I found it, the latter lesions that appeared after the first ones, which were there before I had ever been to that site. So I don't know how long they've been present, but the latter lesions which appeared during the time I've been aware of the fungus and the trees, we could not isolate that fungus in those trees. And again, there's no real explanation for that. But when they determined it was pathogenic on the plains in a laboratory conditions, it's these lesions that were produced even on very young trees. So there's something going on, but there are more questions than answers.
Well, I'm going to try with a couple of questions. So, the first symptom that presented to you before you started looking for lesions, were the leaves wilting? Did they suddenly wilt?
No, it was the other way around. I noted the lesion just purely because it was present, and then later on, yes, it was a vascular wilt, to the best of our understanding. So yes, the crown wilted significantly, and particularly because it was right next to another tree of the same species, it was really apparent, really obvious. And because this tree at this stage, bear in mind, we didn't really know anything about fungus or how it worked. And this tree also had some decay, some really obvious decay in scaffold limbs in the crown, which again you'd think probably would be something to do with Inonotus being a plane tree and that kind of thing. But I hadn't seen any fruit bodies of anything else, so we were considering that. Then we had a kind of a sunken strip, and I do have some images I can share another time of a sunken vertical strip in the upper stem, which led all the way up. It wasn't unbroken, but you could see a path between the lesion that I could see at, let's say, a metre above ground level, the original lesion that I saw, and it was it weaved its way up the stem. And so during the period in which it was really suffering physiologically, it was a clear sunken area in the stem, and then epicormic shoots were produced in that area, and then those epicormic shoots died, which was very surprising.
So what we're going to do, listeners, is Jim is going to send me the photographs by email, and Noel's going to edit them in at various points in this talk. So if you watch this on YouTube, you'll be able to see what he's describing. Sounds really interesting and worrying, because London plains are just one of our survivors in city environments. They're known to be tolerant for root pruning, shoot pruning, often managed as pollards. They give that massive canopy cover that's so important in cities. They're really good at pollution mitigation, and they're part of the sort of cityscape character as well. So the loss of our plains will be devastating. So it's really, for this disease, which I still can't say, it's watch this space, and it's plain canker. I can say plain canker, folks. Jim, can you tell us anything else about this disease, please?
Yes. It's there's something going on. As you've gathered from what I've been saying, I've been gathering and collating evidence, trying to test every tree I can find without bothering with the mutes anymore. Given that, the difficulties I had getting the mute, and the client had to pay for all of that, and in the end we didn't find anything out. So I've just been trying to locate trees where it's reachable from ground, and I've continually tested trees in that situation and found several more across London which have it confirmed. I've also told some of my other clients who are dealing with lots of plane trees that what it is, and when we found it in several locations confirmed. The other thing that's interesting is that, of course, we've also found lots of situations where the lesions are present and we've tested them and still had negative results, and we still have no explanation for that because the lesions look the same. In one instance, there's a lesion which has been there since long before I looked at the tree, and which I'm told by the gardener who has worked at the estate for over 40 years, it was there when he started there. So it's not a new thing. And in other cases, something that's perhaps even more interesting is earlier this year, the beginning of this year, before trees came into leaf, there were an absolute host of trees that suddenly developed all these lesions in close proximity to each other in central London. And since then, I've noted with another colleague a new form of this. Well, let me take that back. I've noticed lesions which look identical forming in trees which had no lesions previously, with an elongated oval, for want of a better term, strip of the lightest sort of grey bark with plane trees. So we all know planes shed bark, but they get down to the really light grey layer, and it's clearly defined around the lesion, so which again suggests it's vascular, and additionally, in several cases, multiple lesions in not directly, straight line, but clearly linked in a vertical path. And that's been this year. Now, because most of those, in fact, all of those pretty much have been quite high in the crown, I haven't yet been able to take samples and confirm that that's definitely N. parvum, but it does seem very likely given the identical nature of the lesions, even though the grey strip has been less consistent in the past. It's not always been there, although it has in some occasions. And I've seen plenty of trees which I've previously seen lesions in now have many more lesions. And so something is changing, and I have nothing other than a guess about why or what that is. But the other interesting thing is that we still haven't determined any cause or any consequence of this other than the lesions themselves. And one other couple of things. Once I've Googled Neophysicoccum parvum online, I've recently found that not only did it come from grapevines, but it has affected other trees, including oriental planes, eucalyptus in various countries, and perhaps strangest of all, quite recently, in another report from Geneva, where the original report we read came from, it's been found to be affecting Sequoiadendron giganteum.
Wow, that's a leap that you wouldn't think of, because you could think, oriental plane, eucalyptus. Maybe. Well, another one with flaky bark, maybe. It's rather a sort of silly thing to say, but
I can get that link there.
But that's weird. So we need to know if it matters. You said about the first tree that wilted. Yes. I mean, could that have been another cause?
Well, it's not impossible. We can't rule that out. So when the tree was taken down, I was on site and took loads of samples and loads of photos. I can show there was cambium death around a good section of the circumference. I took samples in the same way that I'd taken them previously into various discoloured wood. There were other fungi in there, Fusarium, which I understand is quite a common soil fungi and it's quite present in trees. But the N. parvum was present in lots of the clearly affected areas, and so I think it's quite likely, based on the previous evidence from Geneva and what we found there, that N. parvum was certainly a factor, if not the actual cause, and we weren't able to isolate anything else that we would be aware of that could have had such a cause, or could have had such a consequence. So it's definitely a something to be aware of, and the reason we haven't really announced anything so far is because it's more questions than answers, but it's really about, it's been overdue. We've been wanting to let people know about what to look for, because then perhaps between us, with a greater pool of people looking into it, we might find out something sooner. But it's a tricky one.
Talking about a greater pool, listeners, do check out the YouTube channel, see the images, and if you could contact Noel at treeladytalks.co.uk if you too have seen this, and we'll pass it on to Jim, and Jim will pass it on to maybe Alice Holt, and then we can start building up a database or something else that you're curious about with London planes.
Yes, there are a few things with London planes, aren't there?
Well, let's talk about that now. I mean, the one that a lot of our listeners who work in the profession will be aware of is Massaria. Yes. Perhaps you could just describe the basics for those who may be starting out in their career or maybe don't work every day with trees. Let's go back to basics of Massaria. What does it look like and what does it do?
Okay, Massaria is another fungus that affects plane trees, Splanchnonemia platani, and it's I don't know when it was actually first discovered. I believe it was in the mid-noughties, and at the time I was working in Islington, and we found it on a tree. We took, there was a tree with a branch that failed for no obvious reason. It was obvious why it had failed, but we weren't sure how it got into that condition. Basically, it's a fungus that works its way inside the tree, into the branches, decays, forms a soft rot decay on the top of the branch, which means it's obviously quite difficult to see from the ground, and which, as that decay develops, obviously the tension in the branch is damaged, and so the branch tends to fail, sometimes hanging from the lower section of the branch, which might still be intact, sometimes falling completely. There are theories about it being a natural branch shedding tool for the tree, if you like, which has developed and is slightly more aggressive for some reason. It's not really. It's a bit out of my area of expertise to say whether that's the case. It may be latent in the trees. Again, that does appear that way. But the big problem for tree managers and for the trees is the fact that it causes branch failure quite quickly. So that we worked with the London Tree Officers Association to produce with a team of other tree officers who produced the Messaria document, which I would strongly advise you have a look at that if you don't know what it is, because it's freely available at the LTOA website. It's a very good document. It's got lots of great information in there, and it describes the fact that you tend to see this sort of cinnamon, light brown discoloration, bark loss along the top part of the branch, which is, again, not something that's unusual on a plane tree anyway, so it's not easy to spot. But once you get your eye in, it is possible to see it from the ground. The big problem with Messaria, as I say, is the potential branch failure, and the combination with Messaria and Innonotus, which listeners may well be aware of already. Innonotus hispidus, which is a fungus which causes great decay on ash trees, but much less so in plane trees because they're able to compartmentalize decay better. But Innonotus tends to hollow out the middle of the branch, and with Messaria damaging the top of the branch, you can get some very large stems failing. I remember some years back I had a very large stem, must have been 25 centimeters or more across at the base, and it was an upright stem. There was no indication of Innonotus or Messaria. It was in full leaf, and it just fell off one day into a private garden. Fortunately, there was no one there, but it was quite clear that Messaria had worked on what was effectively the top side, even though it was almost vertical, and it had already been hollowed out, presumably by Innonotus, but it just hadn't produced any fruit bodies that we had ever seen, and there wasn't any obvious decay from the ground. But a huge stem basically fell out of the tree onto the ground just like that, and it was in full leaf. So the combination of those two things can be a real problem.
And so when I've seen branches that have fallen from Messaria, I've often seen this characteristic V-shaped wedge.
That's right.
On the top, which is a cinnamon colour.
Yes.
It's not always like that, of course.
No.
Before we go on to talk about Innonotus hispidus, this creates a real problem because, as we spoke about earlier, about London planes often being in city environments, next to busy roads, footpaths, people's houses, commercial buildings, the tolerance of risk, the tolerance of branch failure is very low. So it's really resulted in a sort of high-level inspection regime by a lot of local authorities who own trees or large-scale tree managers. You can see, can't you, that the branch is kind of dying from the ground often, but not always.
True. That's right.
I mean, have you, in your experience as a local authority officer and now managing large-scale tree populations in private practice, have you ever had sort of pressure to remove the tree in advance because it might develop Messaria or it's lost a branch? Has it led to like whole tree felling?
No, definitely not. Although off my head, I'd have to think about whether anyone had initially suggested that. But again, that would be inappropriate, and also would be very unlikely to be successful in the central London situation where many of these trees are protected. But we would obviously discourage that in any case because it's not the solution. Although that said, I have seen plane trees in areas where I don't manage them, but where they are in very poor condition. There's several sites I can think of off the top of my head in East London where they've not had branches removed, but the Messaria affected branches removed. And to be fair, sometimes, we don't know why, they still stay there, even if they are decayed and dead, even completely dead. They do hold on. It's just one of those very unpredictable things. But what I've noticed, and again, this is not scientific, that sometimes with trees that aren't managed and don't have the branches removed, the Messaria seems to spread. And so you end up with almost entirely dead stems and furthermore, more dead stems following on from one another. And so you can end up with situations where, because when you do go in and remove those stems, there's not much left. you are seeing, I mean, these are smaller trees than the initial ones I've talked about in central London, but where you're removing a significant area of the crown because it's become colonised and dead or decayed through Massaria colonisation, then you can end up with trees which probably the best thing to do is remove them, which will be a problem. So it does depend on a variety of circumstances. Again, Massaria, we think, is water related. There's good theories about it being water related in the way that I mentioned earlier, how it might have evolved, if you like, from the tree's own ability to just shut off smaller branches and drop those as part of its natural physiological process. So what we've noted, again, mostly anecdotally, we don't have scientific data on this, but years ago when we were first coming to terms with this problem and finding management options to deal with it, which didn't involve just felling all the plane trees, we noticed that after a drought year, the following year, we would see more Massaria branches present in the crown, more affected and damaged and decayed and dead branches in the crown than in the previous year. To be fair, I think that's less clear nowadays. That seemed to happen several times running, where there was a drought year, the following year it was worse. Perhaps it's to do with the continually rising temperatures, and it's a bit of a vague idea. I don't really know how we can determine that more now, but it's less well defined now. We're seeing, in some cases, there are several people I know who look at plane trees every year. So every year we have a sort of a chat together. How's it looking this year? There are trees that we manage annually, and there are trees that are owned by local authorities, which are obviously managed at least annually and inspected regularly. So we often compare notes about the prevalence of dead Massaria branches, generally speaking, each year. And they do tend to coincide from one area to another. So it may not be a localized water issue. It may be more of a general kind of climate issue. But again, these are all just theories at the moment. There's no detailed science on that.
Well, yes, of course, they're just theories at the moment. Everything needs to be rigorously tested. But we do know that we've had a real problem with sooty bark disease with sycamore on a hot, dry year.
That's true.
Which is endemic within the sycamore trees. That's Cryptostroma corticale, folks. I remembered that one. And so, we've seen real incidences of that with hot, dry summers in cities where water is harder to get. And similarly, another endemic one is Hyptoporus betulina. I remembered it.
Only just.
On silver birches, which again is endemic within the tree, and it's triggered by drought stress. Could it be, and this is just my fanciful theory, you don't have to answer this, could it be that Massaria is now endemic within London Plains and it's triggered?
Yes, it could. And again, I'm not equipped to answer that conclusively, but yes, I think it very much could. And that was a theory we were working on some time. Well, we were assuming that theory to some extent because it's in pretty much every plane tree, and so many even trees that haven't been pruned. It does affect younger trees to a lesser extent, generally speaking, but it does affect them. Interestingly enough, I've seen Neophysica comparvum lesions in young plane trees which haven't been pruned either. So it may be that both of them are endemic. We just don't know. But they're both perfectly reasonable theories, as to the best of my knowledge.
Okay, and we've spoken also about Inonotus hispidus, which is a fungus which is on lots of different hosts. As you said earlier, ash, apple,
trees.
There are, all sorts of other trees. Yes, and it's one that I actually know something about, folks, surprisingly, and I can say it as well. But it in the spring it comes out. It's sort of like a shaggy chamois leather, a sort of orangey chamois leather that's kind of like folded over. And as the season passes, it gets very black, and it sort of decays, and then it often breaks up, and you can see them on the ground. And you get your Inonotus eye in, and then you can see them. And on ash trees, it forms these really obvious lesions going down. We've often then woodpeckers get in there and get these masses of holes in there, and of course it's fantastic habitat if it's in the middle of a field or in the middle of a wood and nobody's walking by, but often it isn't, and then it subsequently leads to loss of vitality in the crown. But in London Plain, you said earlier about the tree is best able to cope with it, and it's not generally a massive issue.
That's true. It hasn't been anyway until this kind of combination problem with Massaria. So I've seen lots of plane trees. I'm sure you have as well, with smaller inner notice holes and lesions with woodpecker holes often associated. But as we've seen in many cases, it tends to hollow out a branch or a part of the stem, but leave the circumference largely intact. And because plane's really strong wood as well, it's far less common for it to cause failures or structural damage in that way. But as I mentioned earlier, with the hollowing of the middle, if you've got a branch where the tension side, whether that be the top or at an angle, is being decayed with the soft rot of Massaria, then you have a problem because all the weight is on the compression side, and you can see the branches fail. That's happened in a lot of cases, and so that's another issue with Massaria, where you can see the smaller branches because they might be discoloured or perhaps even partially failed and hanging on, and so you can spot those quite easily. It's really important when you're doing a Massaria inspection to view the tree from all 360 degrees, because and ideally with binoculars as well, to look into the higher parts of the tree depending on the size, because it is possible to see beginnings of lesions or the beginnings of damage on the top part of the branch, but it's also quite missable. So you'll have to come to a conclusion. Some parties will, who have unlimited or close to unlimited resources, may choose to climb the trees 3 times a year. That's the other interesting thing we discovered, that when the first tree we discovered it on, I mentioned way back when we sent the sample and confirmed it was Massaria, the branch failed, so we sent the sample in, and within 4 months there were other branches in the tree which were also at the point of failure, which are dead and clearly no longer attached properly. And so it can affect branches in a relatively short time frame and render them potentially liable to fail. Although, as we've also said, on some occasions branches can stay in the crown for years. It really depends where the tree is and what the target area is as to how often you need to consider the problem.
She's a lady, she's a lady, she's a lady who can help you with a problem with trees. She's a lady, oh maybe, if there's a subject to accompany a walk, you'll probably find it on the Tree Lady Talk.
Several things came out of that for me. The first thing which you said was often you've got multiple diseases in a tree. So something like inner notice, which would normally be fairly well tolerated in plane tree, you get another agent in and then the tree becomes declined. It may be stressed because of climatic conditions.
In principle, yes, because if you have a tree in your garden, for example, you may be able to control factors regarding its vitality, for example, mulching in that area. But if it's a tree in a municipal park or a tree in the street, for example, I think there's going to be very limited options to try and increase vitality. One thing that's always important, as I know you know, is supporting and preparing for young trees, making sure they are properly established by giving them the best chance, the best start they can, and that's the best way to help them in the future. The problem we have is that streets are not kind of natural environments for trees anyway, so they're already on the back foot to some extent with the pollution, which again, as you point out, plane trees are very good at coping with that, but I assume it must be having some sort of negative effect on some level. And if the trees, as you've just touched upon, if the trees are affected by one thing, they may not be so able to cope with yet another and another. And another sort of slightly potentially depressing way to look at it is with comparison with horse chestnut trees, which are also affected by numerous problems at the moment and have been for some years. So you've got bleeding canker and leaf miner and leaf blotch, for example. All 3 of those problems are very common among chestnut trees, which seem to continue to bounce back year after year. But you've got to assume that at some point there's going to be a turning point. And what I think is important to consider with plane trees is that, as we sort of touched on earlier, they've always been considered sort of indestructible, real soldier trees, real bomb-proof trees that kind of grow through anything. And yet we're aware of canker stain, which we haven't really discussed, but it's not here, thankfully. That's not Splanchniema, it's Serratus cystis botani. So that one has. There have been thousands upon thousands of plane trees removed in other parts of Europe, in France and in Italy, where they were colonized by that fungus, which is, to the best of my broad understanding, is another vascular problem, which is quite a bit more aggressive and very easily transmitted through human behavior. Through the scuff mark against the bark is the most common way. So you might just knock the tree with a passing, I don't know, dust cart or something, and that opens up the vascular tissue, and then the fungal spores get in there, and the tree is very quickly colonized and can die. I think it can take up to a few years for it to die, but it will start to become dysfunctional relatively quickly. And as I said, because it's such an easy one to spread, there have been practices where you have to remove the plane trees very quickly and remove the tree either side of it as well, which is quite extreme. Sounds really extreme, and it obviously is. That isn't here, to the best of our knowledge, but it could get here, and let's face it, things have got here in the past. It's not unlikely that it will get here at some point. And if we have something like that, as well as all the things we've already got, you can only imagine it would be like Dutch elm disease all over again, before our time. But Dutch elms used to be the biggest trees in the country, and there were millions of them. And then a few years later, there were none, or very, very few. And that potentially is a situation that could occur again with plane trees in the worst case scenario.
One of the things we're all learning is that we need diversity in our tree population. Absolutely. To make it sustainable. And whilst nobody wants to see a large-scale loss of any one species, and obviously struggling with ash at the moment, that's serious. If there's ever a silver lining, and it's a tiny one, we will have the opportunity to plant, hopefully, climate-tolerant, wide range of different species. It may be gone are the avenues of single species in the future, and there's much debate about the aesthetics of that, but I think we're all learning that we need to look more broadly at tree planting. I mean, there's an excellent spreadsheet on TDAG, that's TDAG. If you go to their website and look at resources, there is a tree selection list.
It's absolutely fantastic resource, freely available. We use it all the time, and I couldn't agree with you more, Sharon. Actually, the most important thing is to increase diversity, and particularly to plant trees which are more tolerant from their host countries, more tolerant to the increasing temperature and drought conditions, for example, that we are experiencing more as climate change continues. And so one thing we do, whenever we recommend the removal of a tree for whatever reason, we're always recommending a replacement, and we'll always recommend an exotic which is suitable for the conditions we expect to be occurring in as already and in the next few years. So you're right, there is that silver lining. One of the questions to consider there is, for example, with plane trees, there isn't anything like a plane tree. There are trees which have similar leaves, but there's nothing quite like a plane tree, really. So how do you replace a plane? What can you put in instead? I don't know. But one of the things we suggest is pines. We don't have enough conifers. They are underrepresented, and they provide a great deal of ecosystem services, which I think they're underrepresented and perhaps not fully appreciated in that respect. I
agree. I love a pine. Great big air scrubbers, evergreen, exactly. Lots of good stuff going on there. Jim, we could chat for hours and hours. I'm so grateful for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
I really look forward to ongoing research on this.
Yes.
Again, listeners, we want to hear your plane stories. So it's Noel, Noel, at treeladytalks.co.uk. Let's watch our beautiful planes and do everything we can. And keep cheerful. They're not dropping down like flies. We've talked about disease. There's plenty of healthy planes around. So, Jim, thank you.
Thanks very much, Sharon. And thank you, Noel.
I'd like to apologise for some of the background noise on Sharon's interview part of this podcast. We asked London Planes if they'd like to get involved in this podcast, and unfortunately, a lot of them said yes, as the eagle-eared of you will have picked up. Yep, thanks Sharon for that. There's plenty of healthy planes about, and I can attest to that, as most of them wake me up at 6 o'clock in the morning through till 7:30 from Stansted. Thanks very much for that, everybody. 2 reminders from me before you go. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to share it with your friends and family, and you can consider subscribing to the show to make sure you don't miss any episodes. You can find us on our YouTube channel, which is SHA Sharon Hosegood Associates. This video will be on that. You can get us on Instagram, which is @TreeLadyUK, and on the website treeladytalks.co.uk. Thanks for listening.